Daniel stormed through the kitchen, the harsh clatter of his boots against the linoleum echoing in the silent house. The rain outside battered the windows relentlessly, creating a chaotic rhythm that matched the storm in his chest. His dog, Bruno, sat near the back door, ears drooping and his weathered face tilting upward, watching his master with the loyalty that only years of companionship could build. The sight of the old Labrador, once a symbol of simpler and happier times, only deepened Daniel's simmering rage. "Get out of the way," Daniel barked as he yanked open a cabinet, searching for a misplaced stack of papers. Bruno flinched but didn't move, his cloudy eyes trying to read the human's emotions. Daniel groaned loudly. "Useless," he muttered under his breath, though the words hit the air sharper than intended. He slammed the cabinet shut with enough force to rattle the dishes inside. "Why are you even still here, huh? All you do is sit around eating and drooling. You're just like everything else in this damn house, broken and useless." The venom in his voice caused Bruno's tail, which had begun a tentative wag at hearing Daniel's voice, to still entirely. The dog's posture slumped even more, confusion clouding his aging eyes. Daniel's outburst continued, the words spilling out like bile, a torrent of anger that had less to do with the old dog and everything to do with his own spiraling failures. "You just sit there looking at me like that? Like I'm supposed to feel guilty for everything?" Daniel's voice cracked, his face twisted in an unrecognizable expression of shame and fury. "Do you even know what it's like? To have nothing left?" His eyes darted to the rain-streaked window. "You're just a reminder of all of it. Every damn thing I've lost. My job. My family. He cut himself off and turned sharply away from Bruno, his hands gripping the edge of the counter as if it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing. Bruno, unable to grasp the specifics of his master's pain but deeply attuned to the tension in the room, let out a low whine. He inched forward, his movements slow and hesitant, his tail twitching weakly in a plea for peace. Daniel turned, catching sight of the dog's approach, and his rage flared anew. "Don't!" he shouted, the sound so loud it even startled himself. He pointed toward the door, his hand trembling with anger or maybe exhaustion. It was impossible to tell. "Don't come near me. Go lie down or something. Just go." The rain intensified, a deafening roar against the roof, and Daniel could barely hear Bruno's soft whimper. He squeezed his eyes shut, his chest heaving with the effort to contain whatever storm raged inside him. When he opened his eyes again, Bruno was still sitting there, unmoving. "Damn it!" Daniel's fist slammed down onto the counter. The sound made Bruno jump, and Daniel seized on the reaction with more cruel words. "What's the point of you anyway? You're old, you're useless, and you're just holding on for no reason. Just like me." His voice broke again, but this time the words carried a desperate edge that hinted at the hurt beneath the anger. The room fell silent except for the pounding rain. Bruno slowly rose to his feet, his joints creaking audibly, and padded toward the back door. His head hung low, his tail limp, and each step seemed heavy with an unspoken understanding. The sight of Bruno's retreat only served to deepen Daniel's guilt, but the anger, a flimsy barrier against his own despair, wouldn't let him soften. "Fine, go," Daniel yelled after him, his voice raw. "Go outside if that's what you want. I don't care anymore." He yanked the door open, the icy wind and rain immediately whipping through the kitchen and soaking the floor. Bruno hesitated at the threshold, turning his head just slightly to look back at Daniel, his gaze quiet and piercing. "Out!" Daniel barked again, this time pointing out into the torrential rain. Bruno didn't move at first, and for a moment it seemed as though neither of them would budge. But then the dog stepped out into the downpour, his head low and his paws sinking slightly into the muddy ground. He stood there, drenched almost instantly, his silhouette barely visible against the stormy backdrop. He turned his head one last time to glance at Daniel, as if hoping for an ounce of mercy, but Daniel slammed the door shut before their eyes could meet. Inside, Daniel pressed his back against the door, his breathing heavy and uneven. The silence that followed was louder than the storm outside. It gnawed at him, the weight of his words sinking deeper now that Bruno was gone. He looked down at his hands, clenched fists, and forced them open, the tremor in his fingers betraying the conflict within him. The house felt impossibly quiet now. Without Bruno's soft presence, the emptiness seemed to stretch endlessly. Daniel turned toward the window, his vision blurring slightly as he saw Bruno sitting in the rain, his fur matted and his body visibly shivering. He didn't bark or whine, he simply sat there, looking at the house that had always been his safe haven, unsure of why it had suddenly turned so hostile. Daniel stared at the scene, his gut twisting in a way that no amount of anger could numb. He pressed his palm against the cold glass, his jaw tightening as the storm outside mirrored the one within him. And yet he couldn't bring himself to move. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, it was hard to tell. The rain continued its relentless assault, and Bruno's shape became harder to make out through the watery veil. Daniel felt something hot rise in his throat, a sob he barely managed to choke down. He turned away from the window and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing loudly in the hollow silence. The storm outside raged on, but the one inside Daniel had only just begun. Years earlier, the storm that brought Bruno into Daniel's life was not unlike the one raging outside now. Daniel had been driving home late one night, his thoughts tangled in the complexities of managing his newly opened animal sanctuary, a dream he had poured his heart, savings, and countless sleepless nights into. Rain hammered against the windshield, the wipers working overtime as he navigated the narrow, winding road that cut through the forest. That's when he saw it, a small, shivering lump by the side of the road. Daniel's heart twisted as his headlights illuminated the pitiful sight. A puppy, soaked to the bone, trembling violently. He pulled over, rushing out into the downpour without a second thought. The little dog didn't even try to run, too weak to do more than lift its head as Daniel crouched beside it. Its ribs were visible through its thin, sodden fur, and its paws were raw and bleeding. "You poor thing," Daniel murmured, his voice barely audible over the rain. He scooped the puppy up, cradling it against his chest as he hurried back to the car. The pup let out a soft, pitiful whimper but didn't struggle, seemingly resigned to whatever fate awaited it. Daniel named him Bruno. From that day forward, the little dog became his shadow, following him everywhere, his eyes always shining with gratitude and a deep, abiding trust. Daniel nursed him back to health with an almost obsessive dedication, feeding him by hand when Bruno was too weak to eat, staying up through the night to make sure he was breathing evenly. Over time, Bruno transformed into a strong, confident dog, his glossy coat and wagging tail a testament to the love and care he'd received. In those early years, Bruno was more than just a pet. He was a symbol of everything Daniel wanted to achieve. The sanctuary was thriving back then, a haven for abandoned and mistreated animals. Dogs, cats, even the occasional injured bird or wild rabbit, Daniel took them all in. Bruno was the heart of the place, his friendly demeanor and unshakable loyalty a beacon of hope for both the animals and the people who visited. Families would come to adopt, and Bruno would trot alongside them, his wagging tail and bright eyes helping nervous animals feel safe. But dreams are fragile things. Over time, cracks began to form in the foundation of Daniel's sanctuary, small at first, then impossible to ignore. Donations dried up as economic hardships hit the community. Veterinary bills piled up, and Daniel found himself dipping into his personal savings to keep the sanctuary afloat. The stress began to wear on him, his once boundless energy replaced by sleepless nights and a constant knot of anxiety in his chest. He tried everything to save the sanctuary: fundraisers, partnerships with local businesses, even a crowdfunding campaign that barely made a dent in the mounting debt. The animals still came, broken and scared, and Daniel couldn't bring himself to turn them away. But each new arrival felt like another weight added to his shoulders, another reminder of how far he was falling behind. Through it all, Bruno remained by his side. When Daniel sat at his desk late into the night, poring over financial spreadsheets that refused to balance, Bruno would rest his head on his lap, a quiet, steady presence that kept him grounded. When the power was shut off one winter because Daniel couldn't pay the electric bill, Bruno curled up against him under a pile of blankets, his body warmth a small comfort in the freezing darkness. But loyalty can be a double-edged sword. As the sanctuary's decline became a full-blown collapse, Bruno's constant presence began to feel less like a comfort and more like a reminder of Daniel's failures. Every time he looked at the dog, he saw the thriving sanctuary they'd built together, and the ruins it had become. He saw the people who had once looked up to him, the animals he could no longer save, and the life he'd dreamed of but couldn't sustain. The humiliation of it all weighed on him like a leaden cloak. Friends and family had warned him that the sanctuary was too ambitious, that it was doomed from the start, but he hadn't listened. Now, their whispered, "I told you so," this echoed in his mind whenever he walked through the empty pens and overgrown yard. The neighbors who had once praised his work now avoided him, their pitying glances cutting deeper than outright criticism ever could. Bruno, oblivious to the complexities of human pride and failure, continued to follow Daniel with the same unwavering devotion. But for Daniel, every wag of Bruno's tail felt like a rebuke, a silent accusation that he had let them both down. And so, on that stormy night, when the weight of it all became too much, Daniel lashed out. The moment after he slammed the door on Bruno, the house felt impossibly silent. Daniel paced the small, cluttered living room, his hands clenching and unclenching as the echoes of his own words replayed in his mind. The guilt was immediate and suffocating, but he shoved it aside, clinging to the anger like a lifeline. He told himself that Bruno didn't understand, that he wouldn't remember the harsh words or the cold rain. But deep down he knew better. Bruno was more than just a dog. He was a mirror, reflecting back all the love and hope that Daniel had once poured into the sanctuary, and all the bitterness and regret that had taken its place. Sending him out into the rain wasn't just about Bruno, it was about Daniel's desperate, futile attempt to rid himself of the crushing weight of his own failures. Hours passed, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Daniel sat on the edge of the couch, staring blankly at the floor as the guilt gnawed at him. He thought of Bruno out there in the rain, his fur soaked, his old joints aching from the cold. The image was unbearable, but still, Daniel couldn't bring himself to open the door. Admitting that he'd been wrong felt like another failure, another humiliation to add to the ever-growing pile. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the rain-streaked windows, Daniel couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed a flashlight and stumbled out into the yard, the cold, wet grass soaking through his shoes. "Bruno," he called, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Bruno, come on boy. Come inside." There was no answer. Just the steady drum of rain and the distant rustle of wind through the trees. Panic clawed at Daniel's chest as he searched the yard, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. He checked the shed, the empty barn, the overgrown garden. Nothing. "Bruno," he shouted again, his voice breaking. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel sank to his knees in the mud, the flashlight slipping from his grasp as despair washed over him. He had driven away the one soul who had stood by him through everything, the one being who had loved him unconditionally, even when he couldn't love himself. The rain continued to fall, cold and unrelenting as Daniel knelt there, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For the first time in years, he felt utterly, completely alone. Daniel sat slumped in his chair, his head cradled in his hands. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. His chest felt tight, as though the air in the room had thickened, making it impossible to breathe. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Bruno, sitting in the rain, shivering, his eyes full of confusion and hurt. Daniel had thought sending the dog outside would give him some relief, some space to vent his anger without the constant reminder of his failures staring back at him. Instead, it had only deepened the gnawing guilt eating away at him. His mind refused to rest, dragging him through years of memories. He thought about the first time he'd held Bruno in his arms, a scrappy, half-dead puppy he'd rescued from the side of the road. He remembered the countless nights he'd stayed up nursing the dog back to health, watching him grow stronger with each passing day. Bruno had been more than just a dog, he'd been a partner, a symbol of Daniel's determination to create something good in a world that seemed indifferent to suffering. Bruno had been there for everything. When the sanctuary was thriving, bustling with animals and families looking for new companions, Bruno had been at Daniel's side, wagging his tail and greeting everyone with boundless energy. And when the sanctuary began to fall apart, when the donations dried up and the bills piled higher than Daniel could bear to look at, Bruno had stayed just the same, constant, unyielding, always there. Even when Daniel's temper frayed under the weight of his collapsing dream, when he snapped at everyone around him, Bruno had never wavered. The dog had stayed by his side through it all, offering comfort without asking for anything in return. And how had Daniel repaid him? By screaming at him, by slamming the door in his face and leaving him to fend for himself in the pouring rain. Daniel felt sick. The image of Bruno sitting outside, soaked and trembling, refused to leave his mind. What if Bruno had wandered off? What if he'd gotten lost? Or worse, what if the cold and rain had been too much for his aging body to handle? Daniel had pushed Bruno away in a moment of anger, but the thought of losing him was unbearable. He couldn't sit here any longer. He had to find him. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and a heavy coat, pulling the hood over his head as he stepped outside into the storm. The rain had eased into a steady drizzle, but the ground was still a muddy mess, each step sucking at his boots as he made his way across the sanctuary's overgrown yard. The cold bit into his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed with worry. "Bruno," he called, his voice echoing through the empty yard. "Bruno, come on, boy. Where are you?" There was no response, only the sound of rain pattering against the leaves and the distant howl of wind through the trees. Daniel shone his flashlight across the yard, the beam cutting through the darkness but revealing nothing. He checked the spots where Bruno usually liked to rest, the old barn, the covered porch, but they were all empty. Panic began to set in as Daniel realized that Bruno wasn't on the property. He must have wandered off, seeking shelter somewhere else. The forest at the edge of the sanctuary loomed dark and foreboding, the dense canopy blocking out what little light the moon offered. Daniel's hands tightened around the flashlight as he made his way toward the tree line. "Bruno," he shouted again, his voice breaking slightly. He pushed through the undergrowth, the branches clawing at his coat and face as he made his way deeper into the forest. The ground was uneven and treacherous, the mud and roots threatening to trip him with every step. But Daniel didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The memories came rushing back as he searched, each one sharper and more painful than the last. He thought of the nights he'd spent sitting on the floor of his small office, with Bruno resting his head on his lap as he tried to make sense of the sanctuary's finances. He thought of the way Bruno would bring him a toy whenever he seemed stressed, as if trying to remind him that there was still joy to be found, even in the darkest moments. And he thought of the way Bruno had looked at him earlier tonight, confused, hurt, but still hopeful, still loyal, even as Daniel's anger lashed out at him. "Please," Daniel whispered, his breath fogging in the cold night air. "Please let me find him." After what felt like hours of searching, Daniel's flashlight beam finally landed on a familiar shape. Bruno lay curled beneath a massive oak tree, his fur matted and filthy, his body barely moving. Daniel's heart stopped, a wave of terror washing over him as he rushed forward. "Bruno," he cried, falling to his knees beside the dog. His hands trembled as he reached out, gently placing them on Bruno's side. The dog's body was cold and wet, his breathing shallow and labored. For a horrifying moment, Daniel thought he was too late, but then Bruno's eyes fluttered open, his gaze weak but unmistakably familiar. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's okay. I'm here." "I'm so sorry, Bruno. I'm so sorry." Bruno let out a soft whimper, his tail giving the faintest of wags despite his exhaustion. The sight broke Daniel completely. Tears streamed down his face as he cradled Bruno's head in his hands, the weight of his guilt crashing down on him with unbearable force. I shouldn't have done this to you," Daniel choked out, his voice barely audible. "You didn't deserve this. You've never deserved any of this." Daniel pulled off his coat, wrapping it around Bruno's trembling body to keep him warm. The dog barely moved, his energy completely spent, but he didn't resist as Daniel scooped him up into his arms. The journey back to the house was slow and arduous, the mud and uneven ground making every step a challenge. But Daniel didn't care. All that mattered was getting Bruno to safety. When they finally reached the house, Daniel laid Bruno on a pile of blankets by the fireplace, quickly lighting a fire to warm the room. He dried Bruno's fur with a towel, his hands gentle and deliberate, as if afraid of causing the dog any more pain. Bruno's breathing remained shallow, but his eyes stayed on Daniel, watching him with a quiet, trusting gaze that only deepened the ache in Daniel's chest. "I'll make this right," Daniel whispered, stroking Bruno's head. "I swear, Bruno. I'll make this right." But as the night stretched on, Daniel couldn't shake the fear that it might already be too late. The humiliation of his failures, the sanctuary, his temper, his inability to hold onto the life he'd built, seemed insignificant now compared to the possibility of losing Bruno. He had let down everyone who had ever depended on him, but he couldn't let down Bruno. Not again. Not this time. The fire in the hearth crackled weakly, filling the room with flickering light as Daniel sat hunched over Bruno, wrapped in blankets on the living room floor. Bruno's breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling with alarming slowness. Daniel's hands trembled as he stroked the dog's head, whispering words of encouragement that felt hollow even to his own ears. The guilt clung to him like a shroud, suffocating and relentless. Every time Bruno let out a weak whimper, it was like a knife twisting deeper into Daniel's heart. He couldn't just sit here. Bruno needed help, real help, and waiting for him to recover on his own was not an option. Daniel fumbled for his phone with shaking hands, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number for Dr. Greaves, the local veterinarian who had been a steadfast supporter of the sanctuary in its better days. Daniel hesitated for a moment, the weight of his humiliation pressing down on him. It had been months since he'd spoken to Dr. Greaves, months since he'd let his pride drive a wedge between himself and the community that had once rallied around him. But this wasn't about him. This was about Bruno. Swallowing his pride, Daniel pressed the call button. It rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Dr. Greaves speaking. This better be an emergency." "It's Bruno," Daniel blurted, his voice cracking. "He's not doing well. I don't know what to do." There was a pause on the other end, long enough for Daniel to imagine the vet rolling her eyes at yet another plea for help from the man who had let his sanctuary fall apart. But when she spoke, her tone was steady and professional. "Describe his condition." Daniel quickly explained everything: the storm, Bruno's collapse, his weak breathing. As he spoke, the words came out in a desperate rush, and he found himself choking up halfway through. He forced himself to continue, ignoring the lump in his throat. "Get him here now," Dr. Greaves said firmly. "I'll meet you at the clinic. Be careful on the roads." Daniel hung up without another word, his heart pounding. He bundled Bruno in the thickest blankets he could find, carefully lifting the dog into his arms. Bruno let out a soft whine, his eyes fluttering open briefly before closing again. "Hang in there, buddy," Daniel whispered, his voice shaking. "We're going to get you help. I promise." The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time Daniel carried Bruno to his old pickup truck. The engine sputtered to life, and he drove as quickly as he dared through the slick, winding roads. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, and every sharp turn made his stomach churn with anxiety. He couldn't stop replaying the night in his mind, every cruel word he had hurled at Bruno echoing louder and louder until it was deafening. He had failed Bruno in the worst possible way, and now he was terrified it might be too late to make things right. When Daniel finally pulled into the clinic's gravel driveway, the headlights illuminated Dr. Greaves standing at the entrance, her raincoat pulled tight against the cold. She wasted no time, motioning for him to follow her inside as she held the door open. The warmth of the clinic was a stark contrast to the biting cold outside, but it did little to ease Daniel's nerves. "Put him on the table," Dr. Greaves instructed, her tone brisk but not unkind. She had already set up an examination area, the metal table gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Daniel gently laid Bruno down, his hands lingering on the dog's fur for a moment before he stepped back to give her room to work. Dr. Greaves moved quickly, her hands steady as she checked Bruno's vitals. She frowned as she listened to his labored breathing, her brow furrowing deeper with each passing second. Daniel stood off to the side, his arms crossed tightly over his chest as he watched her work. He felt utterly powerless, every second stretching into an eternity. "How bad is it?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Greaves didn't look up from her work. "He's hypothermic, severely dehydrated, and his heart rate is dangerously low. We'll do everything we can, but," she trailed off, finally meeting his eyes. "It's touch and go, Daniel. You need to prepare yourself for that." Daniel's legs threatened to give out beneath him, and he sank into a nearby chair, his head in his hands. The shame and guilt were almost unbearable. How had it come to this? How had he let the one being who had never stopped loving him end up in such a state? Dr. Greaves began administering fluids through and for, wrapping Bruno in thermal blankets and setting up a heat lamp to help stabilize his body temperature. "He's a fighter," she said, her voice softer now. "But he's also old. He's going to need a lot of care, and even then, it's up to him." "I'll do whatever it takes," Daniel said hoarsely, lifting his head to look at her. "Anything. Just tell me what I need to do." For the next several hours, Daniel stayed by Bruno's side. He barely moved, his eyes fixed on the rise and fall of Bruno's chest. Every shallow breath felt like a small victory, but the fear of losing him never abated. Dr. Greaves worked tirelessly, and eventually, a few members of her staff arrived to help. Daniel didn't say much to any of them, too ashamed to face the people who had once admired him for his dedication to animals. But none of them voiced judgment. Instead, they worked quietly and efficiently, doing everything they could to save Bruno. Word of Bruno's condition began to spread through the small town. By mid-morning, a few familiar faces showed up at the clinic. Neighbors, former volunteers from the sanctuary, even a couple of local kids who used to visit Bruno. They brought blankets, supplies, and words of encouragement, their concern for the dog overriding any lingering resentment they might have felt toward Daniel. One older woman, Mrs. Hensley, approached Daniel hesitantly, holding out a thermos of coffee. "I heard about Bruno," she said gently. "He's a good dog. If anyone can pull through this, it's him." Daniel accepted the thermos with a shaky nod, his throat too tight to speak. He felt unworthy of their kindness, but he was grateful nonetheless. As the day wore on, Bruno remained stable but weak. Dr. Greaves gave Daniel a list of instructions for his care, warning him that the next few days would be critical. When it was finally time to bring Bruno home, Daniel carried him out to the truck as if he were made of glass. The drive back was quiet, the weight of everything that had happened pressing heavily on Daniel's chest. Once home, Daniel set up a makeshift bed for Bruno near the fireplace, surrounding him with pillows and blankets. He stayed with him constantly, feeding him small amounts of water and food, adjusting the heat lamp, and talking to him in a soft, steady voice. "You're going to get through this," Daniel whispered, stroking Bruno's head as the dog's eyes fluttered open briefly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll do everything I can to make it up to you. I promise." Bruno's tail gave the faintest of wags, and Daniel felt his chest tighten. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep hope alive. As the fire crackled softly in the background, Daniel resolved to do more than just save Bruno. He would rebuild what he had lost, not just for himself, but for the dog who had never given up on him, even when he had given up on himself. The first few weeks of Bruno's recovery were some of the most humbling and grueling days of Daniel's life. Bruno's condition improved slowly, agonizingly slowly, and every small step forward came with its own set of challenges. Daniel spent most of his time kneeling by Bruno's makeshift bed by the fireplace, coaxing him to eat small morsels of food or drink water. Each moment was steeped in fear, guilt, and an overwhelming determination to make things right. Bruno, despite his weakened state, responded to Daniel's care with the same quiet loyalty he always had. His eyes, though tired and glazed with exhaustion, followed Daniel's every move. The faintest wag of his tail on particularly good days was enough to bring Daniel to tears. He knew how close he had come to losing Bruno, and the weight of his earlier actions haunted him at every turn. The humiliation of having betrayed the only being who had stood by him through everything clung to him, a constant reminder of his failures. The community's support remained steadfast. Neighbors and former sanctuary volunteers stopped by regularly to check on Bruno and bring supplies. At first, Daniel had been reluctant to accept their help, his pride still raw from the sanctuary's collapse and the bridges he had burned in his darkest moments. But as the days passed, their kindness became impossible to ignore. They didn't bring judgment, only warmth and a willingness to help, reminding Daniel that he wasn't as alone as he had once believed. Bruno's strength began to return, little by little. One morning, Daniel woke to find Bruno sitting up on his own for the first time since the storm. The sight sent a wave of relief crashing over him, and he dropped to his knees beside the dog, his hands trembling as he gently stroked Bruno's head. "You're a miracle, you know that?" Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're tougher than I'll ever be." Bruno leaned into Daniel's touch, his tail thumping weakly against the floor. In that moment, Daniel made a silent vow, not just to Bruno, but to himself. He would rebuild. Not just the sanctuary, but their bond, and everything that had been lost in the wake of his failures. He owed it to Bruno, to the animals he had once dedicated his life to, and to the version of himself who had believed in something bigger than his own pain. The path forward was anything but easy. The sanctuary was in ruins, overrun with weeds and suffocated by neglect. The bills that had once crushed Daniel under their weight were still there, a grim reminder of the financial disaster he had tried so hard to escape. But for the first time in years, Daniel felt a flicker of hope, a fragile but persistent ember that urged him to try again. He started small. The first step was clearing the overgrown yard, cutting back the weeds and repairing the fences that had fallen into disrepair. Bruno, though still recovering, insisted on following Daniel around as he worked, his determined steps growing steadier with each passing day. Daniel often found himself glancing back at the dog, his chest tightening with gratitude and shame in equal measure. Bruno had every reason to abandon him, but here he was, unwavering as always. As word of Daniel's efforts spread, people from the community began to show up to help. Former volunteers returned, bringing tools, supplies, and a renewed sense of purpose. They worked alongside Daniel, clearing debris, repainting the faded signs, and repairing the dilapidated pens. Some brought their children, who would sit with Bruno and shower him with gentle pats and treats while the adults worked. Bruno, as always, became the heart of the sanctuary, his presence a source of comfort and inspiration for everyone involved. The first animals to return to the sanctuary were strays brought in by neighbors, cats, dogs, and even a wounded fox. Daniel worked tirelessly to care for them, often staying up late into the night to ensure they were fed, warm, and safe. Bruno took on the role of guardian once more, greeting each new arrival with gentle curiosity and a wag of his tail. His recovery seemed to mirror the sanctuary's progress, and Daniel often wondered if it was the sanctuary that was healing Bruno, or the other way around. Despite the progress, there were moments of doubt, times when Daniel felt the weight of his past failures pressing down on him, threatening to undo everything he had worked to rebuild. The humiliation of his earlier collapse was a shadow that followed him everywhere, a constant reminder of what he had lost. But every time he felt himself slipping, Bruno was there, his quiet presence grounding Daniel and reminding him of why he had started this journey in the first place. The turning point came when a local news outlet caught wind of the sanctuary's revival. A reporter visited to interview Daniel, and though he had been hesitant to share his story, he eventually relented. The article, titled "A Second Chance for the Forgotten," painted a picture of resilience and redemption, focusing on Bruno's recovery and the sanctuary's renewed purpose. The response was overwhelming. Donations began to pour in, and people from surrounding towns reached out to offer their support. The sanctuary's revival picked up momentum. New pens were built, medical equipment was donated, and more animals found their way to the sanctuary's gates. Families came to adopt, and once again, the sanctuary was filled with the sounds of laughter, barking, and the soft purring of contented cats. Bruno, now fully recovered, became the sanctuary's unofficial ambassador. Children flocked to him during visits, and his story of survival and loyalty became a symbol of hope for everyone who crossed the sanctuary's threshold. For Daniel, the sanctuary's revival was more than just a second chance for the animals. It was a second chance for himself, a chance to rebuild not only his dream, but his sense of purpose and connection to the world around him. He often found himself sitting on the porch in the evenings, Bruno at his side, watching the sanctuary come alive with activity. The sight filled him with a quiet pride, but also a deep humility. He knew how close he had come to losing everything, and he would never take any of it for granted again. Bruno remained at the heart of it all, his presence a constant reminder of the power of loyalty and forgiveness. Daniel often caught himself watching the dog as he roamed the sanctuary, greeting visitors and checking on the other animals. Bruno had always been more than just a dog. He was a symbol of everything Daniel had once believed in and everything he had worked to reclaim. The sanctuary thrived once more, its gates open to animals and people alike. For those who visited, it became a place of healing, hope, and second chances. And for Daniel, it was a daily reminder of the lessons Bruno had taught him, that even in the face of failure, there is always a way forward, and that the bonds of loyalty and love can withstand even the darkest storms.